So I'm Breean Beggs. I am the Spokane City Council president and have spent many years in Spokane. Really started out as a community advocate, as a lawyer running the Center for Justice. And over time, I've taken those community conversations and advocacy into trying to create a table where we could create solutions for all sorts of social problems and challenges we have. And today we're talking about homelessness and really what the city is doing and not doing to address homelessness. Well, the city, in the time that I've been on council, which is a little over 5 years, has now started to have shelters for some people. And so I would say that it's working for some people. We've evolved away from temporary cold weather shelters, sometimes just a space on a gym floor, to actually 24/7 low barrier shelters, even co-ed shelters, even shelters with you can bring your animal who's your companion, so you don't have to choose between your companion and getting out of the weather. So we are doing that now. It's just that the scale is so small compared to the need. And so we are doing some good things, and we're now starting to think about regional partnerships that have just begun. I mean, the regional partnerships, we're getting some money from the county for some things, but really all the services are in the city of Spokane, and homelessness is a countywide problem. In fact, 70% of the people who we count as homeless in the city of Spokane and in the area are from within 70 miles of Spokane. So it's not people from the outside, it's really a homegrown issue. And we're serving them, but it would be great to serve them in the city of Spokane Valley, where they're becoming homeless, in the city of Deer Park, in Cheney. So they're served in their network, where they can regain their footing and get back to it, rather than relocating almost as a refugee to downtown Spokane, which is kind of what happens sometimes. Yeah, if you want to define our solution as actual shelter beds for people who are literally unsheltered, not just couch surfing, but literally living outside or in their car, we're way under-resourced. Last estimate I saw is that we have about 900 beds in the county, and the Department of Commerce report that I saw estimated there were 4,000 to 5,000 people unsheltered, and either living in a shelter, one of those 900 beds, or literally outside. And so that's why it's such a huge problem, and everybody sees it, because wherever you are in the county and in the city, there are literally people just there living their lives, being humans, without a place to get out of the weather. And so the scale of the problem is huge, and the resources are small, and we've under-resourced it for so long that solving it seems almost impossible. You know, the cost of providing a shelter bed is about $55 a night. That's about the cost of a pretty low hotel. And so if you want to talk about thousands and thousands of people a night at $55 a night, nobody has the money to do that. And that doesn't mean we don't need to address it and start chipping away at the problem, because as you get someone out of homelessness and back employed and into housing, then they are now contributing to the solution. But you've got to start somewhere, and you have to acknowledge the problem. And I think we as a community have not acknowledged the scale of the problem. And the other thing that I want to say is that a shelter bed is not a shelter bed for all people. There's all different types of reasons. As many people who are homeless, that's how many reasons. So there's your kind of stereotypical person who might be a young male who's just out of work and sleeping in a tent outside, and maybe a bed is a bed is a bed for them. But you've got a homeless veteran with PTSD, and they can't sleep on a gym floor 6 feet from 5 other people. They literally can't sleep. They've got a mental health issue. They need more space. They need privacy. We have friends in the LGBTQ community who are abused and harassed at a normal health homeless shelter. They don't. We have women who have been victims of sex abuse, and they need more protection there. We have younger people who are afraid to go to a shelter with mostly older men. So we have families with young kids. So what we're learning is that we need to design perhaps smaller shelters, but with more variety of services. And as we do that, we find that we're way more effective in getting people out of homelessness and keeping them off the street. Well, here's the thing about shelter bed numbers. It depends on the time of year that you're talking. So I threw out a number of 900, which I got from Department of Commerce. But that's probably in the middle of the winter when our maximum beds are there. We increase capacity typically in the winter. But the thing is, 900 is just a number. It varies. And it's, as you have mentioned previously, it includes all different categories of beds. Certainly a lot of beds that are not low barrier, some that may border on transitional, and people play with the numbers for their own messaging gains that they want to do. But the truth is that we tend to focus in the point in time count that we do. We focus on that number. That number has little to do with the demand or the need. It has to do totally with what the funding is at any one time. And so that's, we sort of measured homelessness last year by how much funding we had for beds, because we didn't count the people who weren't in a shelter and who were homeless. And again, by my estimation from Department of Commerce, it's thousands of people who aren't sheltered in a shelter. And so that's part of the challenge. One of the things that City Council has been advocating for a long time is to have a real-time dashboard as best as possible. And we've had the software for it for well over a year. But there have been political issues about publishing the information. We now have a new commitment from the county and the city together to really publish that so that anyone can see by shelter, by eligibility to be there, so that you will know what the funded beds are in any one night at any one time. That would be helpful. But again, I think it has little relation to how many beds are needed. We supply the beds based on funding. And the point that I would like to make is that where we're moving towards is homelessness being a public health issue and us having to address it. Just like the fire department, if someone calls 911 with a medical emergency, they respond. They don't say, you know what, we only have so much money in our fire budget this year, so we're going to only go to every third call. They respond. And what local governments are realizing is that we're going to have to treat homelessness that way. And the reason is not just for the homeless person who's at risk of dying or having health negative outcomes and then going to the hospital and costing the hospital a lot of money, but the entire community pays a price when people are homeless. If it's a family of homeless people, their children are going to be underperforming in school. They're going to have worse outcomes as they grow up and try to become employed and avoid the criminal justice system. You'll hear the complaints from downtown business owners and hotel owners that, oh my gosh, there's people sleeping in doorways. That's hurting our business and our reputation, or neighborhoods are scared, or people are using places for bathrooms that aren't meant, whether it's polluting the river or just sidewalks. So there's all these things, and we as cities are realizing that we have to solve homelessness like any other public health issue. But we don't have a revenue stream to do it. Typically, we didn't have the scope and the scale of the problem, and typically the federal and state government were big players in that. And now cities, we're grasping with that problem and that challenge, and that's where you see a real disconnect, where you hear people, whether they're advocates for people who are suffering or they're people who are businesses and neighborhoods who are upset that their parks or sidewalks have been taken over. They're like, come on, city, do something. The city just doesn't have an infrastructure. We've got fire and police, and we've got garbage pickup and water delivery. We've got all those services figured out, and we know how to pay for them. We don't know how to pay for homeless services or even housing yet. And so that is our challenge of how do we make that both operational and cultural and mind shift to that. And part of the good news is even this mayor and administration, who kind of campaigned against helping homeless people with low barrier shelters in the campaign, has shifted and said, no, we do have to address it for the whole community. And so I believe the mayor is now on board and joined with council, who all along has been pushing in that direction. And it's a matter of finding the revenue and operationalizing it and being effective across regional lines. And that's, we're figuring that out. Every day that's below freezing is a day too late to figure it out, and yet we continue forward. And I think that's probably the biggest shift for me coming into government as opposed to being an advocate for how I think the world should be. Advocates should be painting the vision of this is how it should be. We should have housing for everybody who needs it. We just should. I mean, no one, I don't think, can really argue against that we shouldn't have it. But making it real and how to do there is an incremental, and it takes time. And so government's doing that. So I love it when advocates say, this is the vision. I love it when the business comes to me and says, I don't want to clean up somebody's mess again at my front door. I'm like, yeah, you shouldn't have to. And we're coming up with ideas and ways to do that. The number one way to solve all that public health is to have actual shelter for actually unsheltered people. That is the number one thing. And I do want to push back against this myth, urban legend out there that the people who are not in shelters don't want to be sheltered. That is just completely untrue, and the numbers don't bear that out. The shelters that we had last year, we had 2 shelters that were low barrier, 24/7 co-ed shelters. They were full every night. They were totally full. And when we closed one of those shelters this summer, which we shouldn't have done, but when the city did it, those people went back to living on the streets. We knew they liked shelters, but they didn't. So there are some people that might not want to go to a particular shelter if the rules are too harsh, or it might be a particular religion, or it's really a drug treatment center and they're not either appropriate for drug treatment or they're not ready. There are occasions like that, but for the most part, people who are living in the cold and the heat, if you gave them low barrier shelter that worked for their psychological and mental health needs, they would take us up on it, and they do regularly. Well, the most important thing is to cultivate empathy for everybody involved. That's the most important thing. When I go to neighborhood council meetings and I meet with business people who are very upset and fearful of people who look and seem different because they're unhoused, they're mostly acting out of fear and concern. And so it's not enough to simply give facts to people and tell people, hey, this is why people are homeless. These are the solutions that work in places, and stop being so fearful and concerned. You can't do that. People can't even listen to you until they've been listened to. So the first thing is to lead with deep listening of whoever you're talking to and engaging with, and find out what their concerns. And when people come to us in City Council and say, hey, I'm going to Coeur d'Alene Park and Brown's Addition, and there are needles there, and I'm afraid I am going to step on a needle, or my child is going to be step on a needle and get a horrible disease and something. You can't say, oh, don't worry about it, the odds are low. You can't say that. You have to start with, yeah, I get it. It's not acceptable. Your concern is totally legitimate. And so you really have to start that way. And you have to do the same with people who are homeless. And I think that is a big challenge, is people who are advocates on either side of the issue, and it's really more than 2 sides, really. There's probably 3 or 4 sides of it, is they are so focused on explaining their truth as they see it, and the distress and the crisis, that the other groups don't hear the empathy and that they're being listened to. So that is the way forward. It's a little bit contrary to our impulse because it is such a crisis. Everyone, regardless of what they feel, they see the crisis and they want to convey it. Until you acknowledge it, they just get louder. And so that is a challenge, and especially I find that even when I'm listening and I'm doing active listening and saying, yes, I'm listening and doing that, people don't even notice that I am listening for a while. It takes a while to do that. So you won't be rewarded immediately by listening and having empathy. It takes a while. That's the number one thing. I think if for the people who aren't homeless and are concerned about it, what I would most want them to realize is that the people that I've interacted with who are homeless, when I've gone to shelters and served meals and talked with people, is that the vast majority of people there are really just everyday people who've fallen on hard times. They just are. I had a similar bias and belief that, everyone's going to be on drugs or have a mental health issue, and that's why they're homeless. And when I served meals, I just found that people were just bewildered. How did this happen? I grew up in this town. I had a job. I had a place. And now I'm living in a shelter with these people, and they're bewildered. And the vast majority of people are in that situation. Now, are some of them with mental health issues, substance abuse issues? Yes. Which came first? Hard to know. I can tell you that based on statistics, the vast majority of people with behavioral health and addiction issues are housed in this community. They are. The vast majority of them are. And yet they're housed and they function in life. And yet there is a group of people who are unhoused who either had those issues before they become unhoused or now have them because they're unhoused. And they need those services as well. But it is not that there are the housed who are fine and the unhoused who are not. They're two different interventions that need to happen. And frankly, they intersect and complicate things. But the idea of Shalom, I of course love. I went to Whitworth University, and I tell people, even though Whitworth is considered a little bit conservative, theological, that I was from the Sermon on the Mount cohort of Whitworth students, which was, we are here on this earth to make a difference and resolve conflict and demonstrate our Creator's affection and care for people by demonstrating compassion to people and empathy to people. It doesn't matter who they are politically, economically, it's how do we bring people together. And that was my cause when I went to Whitworth, and probably one reason I chose it throughout those years. And now it's been, I graduated in 1985, so it's been a long time, and I continue to do that work, and I'm attracted to other people who do that work. And I really see that's the only way forward, is to bring people together and try not to stoke the fires of conflict, but find common ground and compassion and empathy and build that. And the truth is, I've seen people in this debate on homelessness, I've seen people cross those boundaries with each other and listen to each other and break bread together and come together with solutions. And it happens and it works, and it's the only way that we are going to get there, as long as people are talking not just at each other, but past each other. We're not going to get there. But when we get the social service advocates there, the civil rights advocates, the Visit Spokane Tourism Board together, all the medical foundations together, the police, the fire, the downtown business groups, the political class, when we all come together and say, you know what, there are 10 solutions to this. They're going to take a huge influx of funding and coordination, but it does work, and we can do it. But first we have to sit down and agree on a plan. We are breaking new ground. The challenge is, in order to make a real difference, you have to scale it up. But we are. You just look back a few years ago, we did not have a year-round Cannon Street shelter. We didn't have that. That is now year-round, even with an administration that was against low-barrier shelter. That is now a year-round. We're just about to open the Way Out Bridge shelter housing with wraparound services and where people can stay for 90 days, not just night by night, with services, getting them into housing. We have a new Hope House that massively increased the number of women that are served, again, with wraparound services and great rehousing. It's full every night, even though we just totally expanded it, which we'll tell you. We've increased the family. Family Promise is now bigger. We have a new young adult shelter that's going online. Crosswalk is going to be expanded. So we are doing more things. There are more innovative things. The challenge is it feels like, compared to that problem, a drop in the bucket. So we are doing more. We are doing more regional things, partnerships together. In terms of some of the real innovative things, like tiny house villages, more, I would say, resident governed and led entities that you hear about that are pretty exciting to think about. That's going to take a nonprofit entity to put a proposal together and say, hey, we will do this, and then see if we can get funding. And that's one of the challenges, is when people contact me, they say, oh, the city should do a tiny house village. And the thing is, the city doesn't do programming. We're pass-through funding, and it's going to take an entity that's well-funded enough and to put the legwork into developing it, and then come to the city. And then, though, the further problem is, right now we award our homelessness money on 5-year cycles. And that money is all spoken for the most part, absent something from a new foundation or something like that. So to put a new super out-of-the-box program, you have to, are we going to nudge someone else out of the way? So there are a lot of devil in the details kind of problems out there. It's not as easy. When people send me posts of, oh, they're doing this in Austin, it's great. I'm like, yeah, that is great. But that's why it's going to take a real coming together to say, all right, let's look at some of these things. Now in Seattle, the business folks hired a consultant to come up with some of those things. And then they tried to get it on the ballot and do a bond, taxpayer bond, to fund it. It got knocked off the ballot for some strange legal reasons. But that's what it's going to take here, is we're going to need to have a consultant work with all these groups that I mentioned earlier, come together and say, hey, here's these concentric circles, starting at the core and then out with more innovative programming. Here's what it's going to take. And it's going to take, $5 to $7 million a year in new money, not just the tens of millions of dollars a year we're spending now, but in new money to do that. But if we do that and then we just say, hey, we're going to start with what we have and do that, we can get there. And the Avista Foundation has convened a conversation like that, starting, it's, baby steps, but the potential is there. So there is a way forward. It's going to be a group coming together, setting what the problem is, what those numbers of actual homeless, what the current resources are, what they need to be, what are the strategies that work, and then here's the funding source, and then go to both the private sector and the taxpayers and saying, hey, if we really would change this, would you fund, $30 more a year on your home for taxes a year? Would you do that? And it's going to be matched by the business community. Then we could get there. So it's doable, but as you said at the top of it, you got to get out of the rinse and repeat cycle. We are not repeating it the way we have done completely, but in terms of the scale that we're addressing it, yes. And part of it is new politicians come in, we have to train new mayors with it, and people are often in denial. And they're literally just hoping that people who are homeless will leave Spokane. They just really hope that. And then another urban myth, legend out there is that people all over the country are descending on Spokane with free Greyhound bus tickets because, boy, Spokane would be a great place to live in the winter if you're homeless. I'm being facetious here, but that is not happening to any scale. Obviously, some people come from out of town to Spokane, but usually what happens is they come here for some reason, they've got an opportunity, and then they get lost, and then they're stuck here, and they can't leave. But it's our homeless problem is, by the vast majority, is local. So I think the number one thing I would want people to know is that wherever you are in this community, however long you've been here, whether you have a home, whether you have a business or not, whatever your situation, whether you struggle with mental health issues or substance abuse issues, or just putting food on the table and paying your medical bills, we're all people. We all live in Spokane. And the ethic that I am trying to encourage, and I think the way forward for all of us, is that we can acknowledge the truth, that in Spokane, we all belong. And once we acknowledge that we all belong, we can put our solution together, and it's not you and me and the other. It is us together. And we all bring part of the solution. And frankly, we all bring part of the challenges. Just ask the people who know us well. But more of solution than challenge. And so whether it's homelessness or housing in general, how to get more jobs and economic vitality, put Spokane even more on the map that it is, we'll do it together.